All right, good morning. My name is Siegemeister, and today I will be doing a debate review of a pretty old debate. Happened a while ago. Let's see how long ago at this point. 11 months ago, so almost a year, but I really like this debate, and it touches on a bunch of themes that I want to talk about, mainly about liberalism, how it compares to other ideologies, what are the core tenets of liberalism, what are the goals of liberalism, and you know how it functions as an ideology and how it functions politically, and also probably gonna get into like practical applications and some of the struggles of left liberalism in the United States. So yeah, particularly with focus on left liberalism in the American context. Now that we have all that out of the way, let's get it started.
With passage. So I'd like to welcome both of our speakers for a spirited debate. I figure we ought to get into the first topic. Very briefly, in terms of the format, there will be two resolutions, each which should last for about 30 minutes, with both speakers going back and forth. After those two topics are discussed sufficiently, closing remarks will proceed. So the first matter, resolved. The long-term stability and flourishing of our society is better secured by concentrated executive authority than by democratic institutions. Perhaps for a first statement, Professor Allen.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, David. Glad to be here, and thanks to all of you for turning out. You've got dark enlightenment and bright enlightenment. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I'd like to share a little bit about where I come from in answering this question. You heard in the introduction that I am a combination of Harvard prof and democracy advocate. Folks often ask me, what exactly do you do, Danielle, with all of those different balls being juggled? And the answer is simply I work on democracy, past, present, and future, with no question mark at the end of that. That's a focus I come by super honestly. It's a matter of family inheritance, for starters. My dad's dad, my granddad on my dad's side, helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s. Northern Florida at that time was just pretty much the same as Southern Georgia. So it was super dangerous. Lynchings were on the rise. He took his life into his hands to secure the right to vote. On my mom's side, my great-granddad marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917. My great-grandmother ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 30s. And this was because they believe that empowerment is the bedrock for human thriving and well-being. So I was fortunate to acquire that commitment and view as a young person growing up in my family. No surprise in that context, I took that for granted. I took democracy's value for granted as a young person. And of course, as I came of age, watched my own generation come up in the world, the question of democracy's value got a lot more complicated. I watched a real parting of ways, parting of experience. I have had incredible opportunities, immense privilege here in the cathedral. And as well, having had siblings as well who have thrived and so forth. At the same time, though, I have cousins, kids I used to run around the streets playing football with who aren't here any longer for all the hardest things: substance use disorder, incarceration, gun violence. And I hit a point in 2009, I lost my youngest cousin, where I started banging my head against the wall and thinking, democracy is not supposed to be abstractly valuable. Yes, we embrace these ideals of freedom and equality, but the entire point is that when we do, it delivers a society that makes it possible for every generation to do a bit better than the previous, and also for a whole cohort to come up together. And so I started working on this question of how to change the dynamic of our democracy so that it could actually deliver on the promise of democracy. And that work took me in the first instance into criminal justice reform, trying really hard to change criminal justice reform policy. And it doesn't take very long if you try to actually fix something to discover that even if you've got common sense, cross-partisan solutions, it's really hard to get things through because of governance dysfunction. And at this point, I suppose along this path, I had a philosopher dad. I know Curtis had a philosopher dad too. There's a lot of similarity in that story up to that point. And then here we part ways. Curtis sees this kind of moment in American experience, and he says, look, people, the whole history before 20th century, it's all about absolute monarchs, absolute rule, delivering for people. It's about absolute monarchs who operated in a context of belief in racial hierarchy. They delivered for people in the same way that corporations did, with the mission of maximizing their capital. Their capital is land and people. Because of wanting to invest in land and people, because of believing in racial hierarchies, they embrace racial cleansing, and that's what you've got to do to have a society that's going to deliver for people. And so Curtis's view is that our 20th century world is founded on lies, the lies of egalitarianism and the lies that democracy can actually deliver for people. And because it's founded on those lies, he thinks it's foundering. He thinks we need regime change. He thinks we need an absolute monarch, unaccountable, no separation of powers, no checks and balances, no limits, and so forth. Could be Trump. We kind of elected him. Maybe that's already happening. That's what Curtis says in his book. Could be Musk. He doesn't say that in his book, but he has said that previously. Hard to say. Trump, Musk, I don't know, duck, rabbit, one or the other. One of them, anyway, is in charge, going to run things for us and make everything better. Now, clearly, we part ways in that question of how to respond to the current moment. Why? Partly, that history is false in his book. It is not the case that autocracies over the course of history have delivered good for human beings. They have consistently violated freedom, and I will come back to that point. I want you to focus on the idea of freedom and what it is worth to you. The second point is that egalitarianism is not the weak-minded invention of the 20th century. Egalitarianism has been with us for millennia, has been growing in force, goes all the way back to antiquity. Christianity extended it. Already in the early 1600s, you had indentured servants who struck for the right to vote in Jamestown. That same spirit showed up in Plymouth. Ditto the spirit of egalitarianism for all human creatures, Africans as well as everybody else. The Declaration of Independence was earnest in its commitment to equality. It led to the abolition of enslavement in Massachusetts, as well as in Pennsylvania and Vermont before the end of the Revolutionary War. Rhode Island had already rejected racial hierarchy before the Revolutionary War. In other words, it is not a weak-minded idea of the 20th century. What it does, rather, is reflect the claim of ordinary people to freedom. That's all. It's that simple. That's what egalitarianism means. Freedom is both the power to steer my own life in my private circumstances and to contribute with others to steering the public life and shape that constrains us all, the norms and laws. If you love freedom, there is only one possibility, because every unaccountable, and no absolute power is ever accountable. That's the definition of absolute power, is it is not accountable. No absolute power is ever accountable. Absolute power inevitably corrupts, tramples on, persecutes freedom. So the question that we have right now is not whether to have democracy and the protection of freedom, but only how to have that. The only question is, can we redesign our institutions to achieve that? And we can, and the single most useful thing that we could immediately do is party reform. Get rid of party primaries, get rid of the capture of power by political parties that work on the basis of a shrinking base of population to control our institutions. We, the people, need our power back. And with that, we can, in fact, redesign our institutions for effective functioning.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, so if it's not obvious, Professor Allen is going to be debating from the left liberal perspective here. Well, I say left liberal. She calls herself a eudaimonis democratic pragmatist, which is basically a left liberal if you look at how she breaks down her philosophy in her book, Justice by Means of Democracy. Yeah, you basically heard a broad outline of her philosophy there in the intro. It effectively aligns with most people's views of left liberalism, which is a focus on human flourishing and democratic values, and also republicanism, which is effectively that you're guaranteed rights that cannot be taken away from you because they are sort of imbued and guaranteed within the way the government is constituted. So yes, you do have rights as a democratic citizen, but no one can vote away anybody else's rights. And she sort of gave a breakdown of that in the American context and how it was derived from the Declaration of Independence and slowly but surely implemented throughout our history and continues to be implemented. So yeah, it's a pretty good broad outline of left liberalism. Now, one thing she said that I really do not agree with is her view of political parties and the capture of the mechanisms of our democracy by political parties. I know everyone likes to sort of jerk off the George Washington statement about political parties sort of being harmful to our republic or whatever. I don't know the exact quote off the top of my head. But I think people really sort of need ideas to be encoded in useful shorthands, right? You know, like we have flags. Flags have meanings. They usually like derive from the colors, the shapes of the elements on the flag. You know, different aspects of the design of a flag convey important things about the society that the flag represents, right? So political parties serve as a sort of shorthand for a broad range of beliefs that encompass the sort of goals of its members and constituents. You know, you do have like a wide range within those beliefs, but they can be summarized as being, you know, 90+% within range of each other. And where there are differences, they are pretty tolerable to most members of the group. So the point being that you want to have a shorthand that you can use to represent your views to a large public, so that they can sort of look at you and say, oh, okay, I know you probably believe in this, this, and this, right? So that's why I think political parties are useful. they sort of make it a little more difficult to obfuscate your views. Now, how effective that is in the current context, that's up for debate, but that's for a whole host of reasons that I don't think are inherent to political parties themselves. So, yeah, I would very strongly disagree with her characterization of the nature of parties and the role they serve in our system. I think some much more important things to focus on would be political gerrymandering, the exact definition of speech and how money affects political speech, and honestly, citizenship among the general public. Like, there is, I guess, a sort of general trend of viewing politics as a bad word. You know, politics is essential to everyday life. Politics is essential to how we organize ourselves. The definition I like to use of politics is basically a stand-in for war for resource allocation. You know, politics is not a game. It's deadly serious. And there are a lot of ways in which people don't take it seriously as they should. And that is purposefully undermined by a lot of people who would seek to use politics as a vehicle to accomplish goals that are sort of antithetical to the needs of broader society. So I'll probably get into that at some point, but that's sort of beyond the scope of the analysis of her intro. So, okay, let's get to Curtis Yarvin's opening statement.
For Allen, Mr. Yarvin, your response and your own presentation.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone who made this event possible. Professor Allen, of course, showed a lot of courage here and a lot of hard work. I'd like to also thank, Harvard University. We're not supposed to mention the name of the school.
Unclear.
Unclear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this possible, including the school where we are, including Passage Press, my publisher, including the John Adams Society, woohoo, out there in the public. And yeah, I think it's sort of a great opportunity to kind of test my views against Professor Allen. I guess I would say, I grew up in a sort of very different context. I grew up inside what's called the deep state sometimes because my father was a foreign service officer and my mother worked at the DOE and my stepfather actually worked on the Hill for many years and now teaches at Hopkins SAIS. And he worked for Biden actually for a while. And when I observed sort of the underbelly of this system from the inside, it did not seem to have very much to do with the kind of abstractions that Professor Allen talks about. And so in a way, I have kind of two preliminary responses to Professor Allen's narrative. One is that, reading her book, and I was reading, Democracy. Was Democracy is a Path to Justice? Is the
Other way around, my friend.
Justice is a Path to Democracy.
Justice by means of democracy.
Justice by means of democracy. And reading that, I was sort of like, it made me feel like I was reading, in a way, a work of Islamic history that was written by a Muslim. And I'm like, because this is someone who believes entirely in the system that she's describing. And so, not to, of course, have any negative discussion of the Muslim faith, but the thing is, if I'm reading a Muslim history of, say, the Abbasids of Damascus in the 9th century, written by a Muslim, I expect them to be very concerned with, is this the true caliph? Is this the real Islam? And so on and so forth, none of which, as a non-Muslim, are questions that really relate to me. And so when I read, for example, Justice by Means of Democracy, I sort of notice every chapter starting with, there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. And I'm like, I get it, this is what you believe in. But these abstractions seem uncorrelated with the realities. And what this reminds...
So he's using an interesting rhetorical trick here, right? So politics is inherently an abstract pursuit, right? You have to sort of outline your beliefs. You have to correlate them to the realities of human existence and sort of delineate what outcomes you expect to achieve by means of implementing your political beliefs, right? So her book very much does that, but it's a very academic treatise. It uses a lot of heavy terminology, and it does include a lot of sort of, I guess you could call them presuppositions, but they're not like sort of, I guess, faith-based, yeah, they're axiomatic, but they're not unfalsifiable. So, anyone is going to have some degree of axiomatic belief in their political system. That just means you have certain elements that you believe in, they're irreducible. So he's taking those irreducible elements of her politics and sort of conflating them with being unfalsifiable. Like, just because something is irreducible doesn't mean it's unfalsifiable. Okay, so she broadly outlines her goals in her book. Like, her priorities are human flourishing, maintaining both positive and negative rights, and various other things that sort of align with a left liberal perspective, and just sort of outlining how our political system meets and doesn't meet those goals as delineated in her book. So you're always gonna, he does the same thing on his blog. Like, he analyzes everything through his lens of sort of right-wing, how would I describe it? I had a term I want to use for it. This sort of like, I guess, corporate or fascist, like techno-monarchical sort of worldview. So you could, throw that same accusation right back at him. The only thing is, right-wing philosophies do tend to have lower levels of abstraction, so they sort of use their decreased abstraction as a means to attack more left-wing oriented beliefs. So that's a rhetorical attack you sort of have to watch out for from right-wingers, because just because your beliefs are more quote-unquote concrete doesn't mean that they map onto reality more cleanly. There are plenty of things that are not concrete, they're highly abstract. Like, a lot of mathematics is extremely abstract. Like, you have things called imaginary numbers, which is a terrible name, but they correlate to phenomena in the real world when you are sort of making mathematical postulations. Just because they're extremely abstract doesn't mean they map badly onto reality. In fact, mathematics probably is the cleanest thing that we've done as humans in terms of mapping sort of linguistic or abstract constructions onto the real world. So that's sort of like that sort of attack really doesn't fly. So just watch for him to do this sort of thing all throughout the debate. He, just loves to employ this very common right-wing rhetorical tactic.
Reminded me the most, besides this observation about Islamic history, is it reminded me of one of the books that I really learned political philosophy from, because I'm an adherent of what's called the Italian school of political philosophy. And there was a great, great introduction to this, which I found by chance in a used bookstore, which is James Burnham's The Machiavellians. And The Machiavellians starts with, I think, one of the great political essays of all time, which is a takedown of Dante. And it is a review of Dante's book, De Monarchia. And Burnham, who was at the time metamorphosing from a Trotskyist into a neocon, and he was one of the first to make that transformation. This book is written in 1940. Looks at this, he reads De Monarchia, which is a book of political theory by none other than Dante, and he summarizes the arguments of De Monarchia in a way that sort of describes these kind of very, very lofty abstractions. And then he's like, all right, you can't even process these abstractions, let's process the reality. And so the reality is, instead of talking about abstractions, what Dante is really talking about is the conflict between two political factions, known as the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs, I believe. And all of these abstractions are basically Dante's way of saying, I forget if it's the white Guelphs or the black Guelphs that Dante is a member of, but it sort of reduces to a very specific set of political behaviors. So I think when I looked at sort of the reality in which I lived, I noticed sort of abstractions.
So again, he's very clearly employing this right-wing rhetorical strategy of attacking the concept of abstractions. Say, hey, these are just lofty, overwrought metaphors that correspond to things in the real world that can be described much more simply, and they are... So he's going to sort of try to paint abstraction as sort of an inherent propaganda tool that is used by, elites, quote unquote, to sort of paper over the goals of their political philosophy.
Like democracy, that are used in ways that, seem very... I think tendentious is not too, difficult to word. And so, for example, when I read Professor Allen's, definition of democracy, she seems to define democracy, almost the word, the symbol, as a good. And then defining the symbol, what constitutes democracy, it's not simply having elections, it's principles like difference without domination. It's basically principles of, like, you can't be a democracy. Just having elections and electing leaders who, take office and exercise power because they won the election, that's not democracy. Oh no, democracy is sort of all of these intangible things that go along with this. And I'm like, is this the world's longest case of no true Scotsman? Because actually, if I'm going about to defining a Scotsman, I might say it's someone who was born in Scotland or someone who's a Scottish citizen or sort of simple cases like this. And when I define democracy, I'm like, there's a very simple question. How democratic is this country? And my answer to that is simply taking this not, going back and separating the is-ought distinction and saying, I'm like, how much power do the voters have? If the voters have no power at all, for example, in the EU, they'll frequently talk of the democratic deficit, indicating that actually the parliament, the European Parliament that's elected by the voters, is almost entirely symbolic and has no power. And actually, the real Europe is run by the European Commission, which is accountable to nobody, like the Supreme Court. And so actually, or like Harvard. And so, what we see people defending when they defend democracy, so-called, is they'll use terms like civil society, or they'll say our institutions. And these things seem to me to have nothing at all to do with giving power to elections. So for example, I may be somewhere in the book, but I did not find any recognition in Professor Allen's book of the fact that the House of Representatives, the so-called home of democracy as defined by the founders, has a 98% incumbency rate. Or that if you're a freshman representative in the House of Representatives, you start at the very bottom. And so actually it seems to me that if I look at the real Congress, this is actually a buffer against democracy, against populism, as you might say, because when I hear the word populism, I view that as a synonym for democracy, and no, I don't think of it as a good thing. And so actually that difference over the meaning of the word democracy seems to me to be what we should focus on tonight.
Professor.
Okay, so that's the end of his opening statement. So as you can see there, he performs a bunch of rhetorical tricks, right? So he reduces democracy down to a sort of like populist definition, right? Most countries that are, organized as democracies do not call themselves pure democracies. The vast majority of democracies are democratic republics, all right? Republicanism is core to any modern democracy, all right? That just means you have systems through which democratic will is represented. You do not vote on every single measure or law or statute or, constitutional provision. Okay. So, and you have certain principles that cannot be violated even through democratic means. So that's what most democratic republics are organized as. All right. Second, any modern state requires a complex, persistent bureaucracy. Now, most right-wing, far-right, let's just qualify, far-right political philosophies view any sort of bureaucracy that obviates the will of the executive as detrimental. So, a lot of right-wingers will say the president has the right to sort of dictate the functionality of any sort of federal agencies or bodies or institutions, and we've seen a lot of that implemented during Trump's term. He's violated a lot of norms as far as hiring and firing of federal employees, the function of federal agencies, and he's even outright shut down USAID, the Department of Education, and other federal agencies under the remit of the executive, but that were instantiated by Congress and funded by Congress. So violating several statutes as far as impoundment and allocation of funds, in addition to just, sort of obviating the certain aspects of the balance of power between Congress and the executive. Now, unfortunately, we have a right-wing Supreme Court who agrees with this sort of plenary executive. Go into detail about that more at a certain point, but basically, a lot of right-wingers view the power of the executive in terms of implementing the laws as absolute. They don't view Congress's sort of prescriptions as a limitation as to what they choose to do with funds allocated for certain purposes within that are executed by the executive. So he's going to get a lot into that and how he views these sort of limitations as anti-democratic, even though we are supposed, a president being elected, first of all, a president is not the only manifestation of democratic will. He's elected to serve a certain role. Now, our news media doesn't really do a good job in conveying what that role is to the average person. So unfortunately, in the US, most people do think they are effectively electing a king when they vote for president, and they don't really understand their obligations as citizens within various other aspects of our democracy, which is a shame because the US is probably the most democratic country on earth in terms of the mechanisms we have to affect our, political will as average citizens. It's just that most people do not participate at the level that's required to affect their will, and they sort of project all of those perceived failures of the democratic process onto the president, again, because our news media does not do a good job of conveying the various aspects of our democratic system to the people and what roles each section of the democracy serves in terms of affecting the people's will. So they get into that a little bit, but I think the debate tends to focus more on other mechanisms of the democratic process.
Alan, your response?
Well, for starters, I appreciate so much that you've understood that there's conviction in my book. You're quite right that there's conviction in my book. Nihilistic narcissism is not my jam. Maybe yours, it's not my jam. So let's talk about democracy specifically.
So basically their nihilistic narcissism is, so nihilism is, it can be defined a bunch of different ways. The definition that she's going with here is, well, specifically with the modifying narcissism, right? So we all know what narcissism is. It's like a sense of self-importance that sort of limits empathetic capacity, makes you value yourself above other human beings, and almost creates like anti-social tendencies purely by virtue of your inability to value others the same as yourself. But here, as a modifier to nihilism, it merely means that there is no inherent meaning in anything. Any meaning that you derive from the world is purely found within yourself and how you define things to mean. So basically the point is that she's saying is she believes certain beliefs map onto reality in a certain way and affect certain outcomes in the real world. They're emergent properties of the way the world is constituted and human biology and the way we interact together to form societies. And if you want to affect certain outcomes, you have to define those ideologies and the way you implement them to affect those outcomes, right? So typically, like the opposite of nihilism, if you want to get into like philosophical definitions of things, would be like teleology, that things have innate meaning, but you don't have to define it that way, because a lot of meaning can be viewed as like emergent properties of the physical world without necessarily being viewed as teleological. But again, that's pretty abstract. I kind of wanted to break this debate down because it does get into a lot of abstract concepts and I wanted to make it more accessible. So basically all she's saying is that, I believe there are certain things that are real that are conveyed by abstract concepts and abstract terminology, but just because they're abstract doesn't make them any less real or the outcomes that they produce in the real world any less meaningful.
And in order to do that, we have to dig deeper into the meaning of freedom and also the meaning of equality and precisely what it is we're trying to protect. As I begin to do that, let me though also say, I also think there's a problem with the incumbency rate, for sure. Why did I highlight party reform? Precisely because we don't really have competitive elections any longer. So I agree that in many ways our democracy is not functioning to the standard of democracy. Again, that's where we agree. The divergence is in whether the question is regime change to unaccountable CEO monarchs, Trump and Musk, or renovating our democracy. Now, again, back to the root and to the meaning. One of the things that Mr. Yarvin likes to focus on and insist on is that human difference is fundamental and that we should organize our way of thinking about society based on structures of, again, racial hierarchy. And he introduces DNA as the proof of that point. Now, and he introduces these points as refutations of egalitarianism. Egalitarianism precedes human difference. There is no such thing as human difference without the category of the human, right? Now, what is it about the category of the human that we are all members of? That category captures the fact that each of us is a judging creature. We have moral capacity, and we're all trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. We choose moment by moment, day by day, because we're trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. In choosing being moral creatures, we are activating our freedom, expressing our desire for it. It is the core of our basic human dignity and what requires protection in order to achieve human flourishing. That is the fundamental ground, the conviction. So yes, there is conviction in my book, 100%. But that conviction is grounded on recognizing, again, that human equality precedes human difference. Now, this is not to say that we are all the same. To the contrary, we come in all kinds of different sizes and shapes and colors and capacities and et cetera. We are so various, and that is the beauty of humanity. But we can talk about and appreciate human difference only because of human equality. And then also we have to recognize, of course, that groups are changeable and various, that how people connect evolves over time, and it is impossible to say what strivings and what talents land where within the population. And the only way we can maximize the value of human beings is to maximize our protection of freedom. That's it. And so, what protects freedom? Governing ourselves in our private sphere and governing together with others in the public sphere. And there's only one name for that, democracy. All the rest is a question of engineering. That is what he's really asking about, Mr. Yarvin here, is really asking questions about engineering. And yes, we have a heck of a lot of engineering improvements to bring to our democracy.
Mr. Yarvin, a question for you. Obviously.
Okay, so she sort of pre-buddied a lot of his attacks based on what he's said so far in the debate. So she has a conception of equality that's pretty core to any liberal philosophy, right? Equality doesn't mean that we're identical or that, you know, we treat each other exactly the same in any and all contexts, or that we are legally treated the same in any and all contexts even. But it means that we all have equal value before the law, equal value in society, and equal value in terms of our ability to affect change within the government. How that's manifested can be sort of like transmuted and permutated through different modes of organization. But effectively, the ultimate goal is to achieve equality, and there is no equality if you don't have freedom within the left liberal philosophy. So there are a lot of ways in which left liberals are sort of disadvantaged versus other political philosophies that I will get more into as the debate goes on. So I'll just let it play a little bit, and maybe we can get more into it as they sort of touch on more aspects of, you know, sort of the nature of these differing political philosophies further along in the debate.
Obviously, this topic of accountability within your proposed system, that's obviously a question everyone has. You know, how you deal with that problem, namely, how do you make some kind of strong executive, how do you hold him accountable, properly speaking?
I thought that was the second part of the debate.
No, the second part's about Harvard itself and what Harvard represents. And, you know, in
all right.
this
Well,
sort of elite formation
let me take a step back and let me first respond to Professor Allen's point about equality, which consists of what I would say a lot of relatively unfalsifiable abstractions. To slightly sharpen the point, I would say that if we consider the statement, all men or all human beings are created equal, we can consider that as an abstract expression of philosophy, as a kind of confession of religious faith, or we can consider that as an empirical statement. If we were to consider it as an empirical statement, I would say, okay, if you consider that true, here's a much more true statement. All identical twins are...
Okay, sorry, I had to take a call. Gonna rewind a bit.
Debate?
Hopefully I get to the right
No,
spot.
the second part's about Harvard itself and what Harvard represents. And, you know, in
all right.
this sort of elite
Well,
formation
let
institution.
me take a step back and let me first respond to Professor Allen's point about equality, which consists of what I would say a lot of relatively unfalsifiable abstractions. To slightly sharpen the point,
See, there he used that term, unfalsifiable, right? So again, he is conflating axiomatic beliefs with unfalsifiable claims. Okay, so you have to watch out for that rhetorical tactic from right wingers. They love deploying that against people on the left side of the political spectrum, but especially liberals, because even compared to other philosophies on the left side of the political spectrum, liberalism does deal quite heavily in abstractions. Yeah, even in a relative sense.
I would say that if we consider the statement, all men or all human beings are created equal, we can consider that as an abstract expression of philosophy, as a kind of confession of religious faith, or we can consider that as an empirical statement. If we were to consider it as an empirical statement, I would say, okay, if you consider that true, here's a much more true statement. All identical twins are created equal. And
What does that mean?
I mean that all identical twins are basically born genetically equal with the same capacities and the same needs and the same goals. I completely reject the idea that all human beings are, sure, we have many things in common, but the regime, the way of living, one of the basic truths of essentially classical political philosophy, which is being rediscovered to this day, is that there is no system of government that is appropriate for all peoples at all times. And as a reductio ad absurdum, I would point to the question of uncontacted tribes. Okay, what is right for the citizens of Greater Andaman Island? Okay, should we invade the Andaman Islands? Should we take away their bows? Should we give them the right to vote? What about the citizens of uncontacted tribes in the Amazon? Is it right for them to be basically rounded up, issued with ballots, and told to vote for the president of Brazil? Will that really be the thing that helps them, basically choosing between Lula and Bolsonaro Jr.? No, I don't think that that's what these people need. And my standard of government goes back to Alexander Pope, who had this great line, for forms of government, let fools contest, whatever governs best is best. I think I messed that up a little. And so when I look at the objective results of governance in this country today, I can't help but observe, our burned out, desolate inner cities. I can't help, but observe there are numerous places in this country where you can go that were clearly flourishing 50 years ago that are no longer flourishing. And in my standard of government, I basically return to Thomas Carlyle's idea of the condition of England question. And this is an explicit kind of renunciation of statistics. You say that, when you consider the condition of England or the condition of anywhere, look at them and say, how are these people living? Is the government helping them to flourish? Is it helping them to live well? I think one of the things that I noticed most closely in Professor Allen's work is that there's this returning emphasis to what might be called a positive liberty, or the liberties of the ancients, which is essentially this idea that exercising political power is a matter of birthright and is a matter of being very important to the nature of a human being in a civilized society. I'm with Charles I on this, who said a subject and a sovereign are clean different things. I actually believe that there is a natural desire for political power that is essential not only in our human ancestry, but actually in our simian ancestry, because we observe that chimpanzees live in a very similar way. If you want to be a chimpanzee who spreads his DNA, you better be the chief chimp. And so this desire for power, this importance, this sort of lust for mattering. Everyone who writes an admissions, essay to Harvard, wants to make an impact on the world. They want to change the world. They want to do all these things. They want power. And and for me, that desire for power, which seems to Professor Allen to be a very positive thing and a thing that is entirely benign, I see that actually as a kind of lust, really almost as a sin that has sort of caused great damage to the world and the lives of those now living.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. All right, so one of the first things he does is something that right-wingers love to do, right? They conflate this sort of a concept of equality with sort of a flattening of identity, right? Like sort of saying like, oh, if you are looking for equality among, if you believe that all humans are equal, you believe all human needs, all human desires, all human modes of organization ought to be identical. So again, so let's go back to what Professor Allen calls herself, right? She calls herself a eudaimonis democratic pragmatist, right? Pragmatism is core to any political, any left liberal political philosophy, right? Pragmatism necessitates pluralism, right? So pluralism is a concept that you can sort of incorporate many different modes of belief within a liberal political system. Okay, sorry, got a spammer on kick already. So, all right. Okay, need to figure out how that works. Okay, so yeah, just because you believe people are equal doesn't mean you believe their needs are the same, their desires are the same, or the way they organize. Okay, so I need to figure out a way to how do I stop that from happening. Okay. So he brings up the people of the Andaman Islands, right? Obviously, there are no liberals out here trying to go to uncontacted nations and trying to say, hey, you guys have a backwards mode of living, you know, come into our system, it's better, you'll have much better outcomes. Here, look at all these metrics, that's ridiculous, right? And that's where the pragmatism aspect comes in, right? Liberalism doesn't typically seek to impose things on people that are incompatible with their modes of organization, right? Most people are not living in systems where it's okay to do crazy things to each other, like rape or murder or kill anybody. So you're typically going to live within a system where like whatever's happening is going to be compatible with different modes of organization that are not sort of a baseline antithetical to a sort of liberal philosophy. So, that's really a straw man attack from him. But what they do is they use a straw man to sort of set up their view that if humans are not equal and cannot be equal, except, in the case of identical twins or triplets or whatever, again, there's that taking an abstract concept, right, and concretizing it, right? Saying like, oh, no one can be equal unless they are literally genetically, physically, spatially, identical, i.e. twins, triplets, whatever, So you're taking an abstract concept, concretizing it, and then you're using that concretized straw man to attack the abstraction that has a certain outcome as a goal. So again, he's going to employ that tactic over and over and over again. And if you don't know how to recognize it, it can either be somewhat convincing or sort of confuse your ability to recognize what their interlocutor is asserting or the goals of the interlocutor. But I think Professor Allen does a really good job of countering his attacks and his strawman.
I assume you'd like to respond.
I will. Is there time still?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Alrighty. No, I would like to, because I'd like to clear up a couple of confusions. So the first is about the term equality, and the second is about the term power. So, for starters, equality. Equality comes in a variety of forms. It's really important. Anytime somebody wants to talk to you about equality or egalitarianism, ask them what kind of equality they mean. They may be talking about human moral equality. They may be talking about political equality. They may be talking about social equality. They may be talking about intellectual equality. They may be talking about economic equality, etc. In other words, you don't know what somebody means by equality or egalitarianism until you ask them precisely which concept of equality they're using. Human beings are morally equal in the way that I described. We are all members of the same species. Even those identical twins are morally equal to each other. They're also equal to each other in some other ways that most other human beings are not equal to each other in, but let's not confuse our different concepts of equality. That's really important. And again, anytime you hear anybody critique egalitarianism, ask them to account for what account of equality precisely are they critiquing. And if they can't offer an accurate account of the theory of equality or egalitarianism they're critiquing, you should pass that argument by. So that's the
Yeah, exactly. So here she's saying like, oh, he's setting up this straw man of the concept of equality. He's not defining it accurately. Like in any debate, you really should steelman your opponent's point of view before attempting to knock it down. Unless, of course, they are sort of creating a sort of pretext. So in that case, first you would sort of steelman the sort of best faith view of what they're saying, but then you would sort of say, hey, they're trying to creep in this sort of a subtext, basically using this sort of stronger version of what they're asserting, and here is the real meaning underneath all of that. Now, you could say, hey, isn't that what Curtis Yarvin is doing here? But not really, because, again, he doesn't really address the points that Professor Allen is making, nor does he seriously contend with the sort of mechanisms and the outcomes of her political philosophy.
First
Can
point.
I ask a quick check on that?
No, let me make the second point, then you can come back, because you had a lot in what you said. So let me just make the point about power. A couple different categories here. Freedom, self-government, power, and domination. What Mr. Yarvin is attributing to me in the treatment of power is actually the concept of domination. Yes, human beings are beset with a drive to dominate others. We watch that all around us all the time. We're probably watching it in this debate right now between the two of us, coming from both of us in relationship to each other, for sure. Human beings are beset by the desire to dominate. That is a bad feature of human beings. Why? Because the desire to dominate impedes the desire and aspiration for freedom coming from somebody else. The goal, as we seek to protect and support human flourishing, is in fact to achieve spheres of agency for ourselves, for all of us, that we all are able to be full agents. And there's only one way to do that, again, by protecting our private sphere and by giving us the opportunity to co-create the public sphere. It is the only solution to the problem of domination. So no, when I am arguing for political equality, I'm not arguing for domination. I am arguing for a sharing of power in order to protect freedom for all of us morally equal human beings.
On moral equality and power, as defined.
On moral equality and power. So, sort of trying to tease apart some of these, I would say, relatively tendentious definitions. First of all, there's a useful thought experiment here. Surely Professor Allen would not extend the principle of moral equality to chimpanzees. And yet chimpanzees are our cousins. They are, completely related to us, all of us except, I would imagine, except Darwin in this room. And there is, of course, a continuous genetic chain of linkage that traces us back to our simian friends. And so, one of the things, and actually of all people who observed this, it was Stephen Jay Gould, the communist evolutionary biologist, who observed this, Harvard communist evolutionary biologist, Marxist at least, he observed, a curious fact, which is that actually there are a lot of missing links between us and the chimpanzee. There's Homo habilis, there's Australopithecus, afarensis, and we would have a lot of trouble if those more divergent forms were living among us today of deciding, do they deserve moral equality? And so my question, my sort of thought experiment question for Professor Allen is if we were able to decode the genome of, let's say, Homo habilis, who lived, 2 million years ago, and somehow implant that in a human cell like those dire wolves you keep hearing about, and would that be a being with this moral equality that Professor Allen describes? Because if humanness is a Boolean quality, as we say in computer science, if it's 0 or 1, there must have been a mother who was not morally equal to us, who had a child who was morally equal to us. And I'm curious as to how that process worked and how her theory deals with that. Secondly, when it comes to power, it's very interesting. We've heard Professor Allen, praising humanity to the skies here, but then we discover that actually this very essential element of human nature, the desire to dominate, the libido dominandi, as they say, is an essential quality of humanity. And Professor Allen thinks it's bad. She actually wants to reform humanity. She wants to create what used to be called the new Soviet man that would not have that desire. What I observe when I take Aristotle's 3 forms of government, monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, the rule of the one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. And I think Aristotle kind of made a mistake by saying, okay, there's 6 forms, there's a good form and a bad form of each. I really like them as neutral qualities because I think all of those sort of forms of power, and they are all forms of power, are very, very important. And the principles, I would translate monarchy, oligarchy, democracy in today's terms into the principles of authority or...
Okay, so let's get into what he said a bit earlier. So, yeah, he's, again, invoking sort of, I guess, strained hypothetical to sort of contest this notion of, like, human equality, right? So he's like, okay, so we're all Homo sapiens right now, but what if we still had some other members of the Homo species among us, right? Or genus, the Homo genus among us, right? What if we had Homo habilis, Homo erectus? Like, at what point do you delineate Homo sapiens, and at what point do all members of Homo sapiens have quote-unquote equality? First of all, if we still had other members of the Homo genus among us, we'd obviously have negotiated what it means to be sort of person or human, a person in the legal sense, differently on the basis of how we interacted with one another and how we constructed societies as separate species within the genus. So again, that's a strained hypothetical. because it posits like a situation that we haven't had to deal with. And if we did, like we would probably come to some workable solution. Again, like a key tenet of left liberalism is the aspect of pragmatism. And a lot of other political philosophies do not like to deal with this aspect of left liberalism. They create these absolutist strawmans, and they just sort of present them as sort of like unmodifiable sort of faults within the sort of left liberal political philosophy.
Or authoritarianism. I translate oligarchy as a concept near and dear here at a university that will not be named as meritocracy or prestige, and I translate democracy as popularity or populism. And so what I see is that all of these forms are active today, and those who believe that our society should be ruled by prestige, by prestigious institutions, by civil society, are very, very against authority. But what you notice is that actually those institutions are quite unaccountable. Nobody elected Anthony Fauci. Nobody elected Anthony Fauci when he basically supervised the program to invent COVID. Nobody elected Anthony Fauci when he covered it up. Nobody elected Anthony Fauci when he told us to stand 6 feet apart based on some science fair project that nobody actually knows where that number came from. And so actually, delegating this authority to prestige, which seemed like a no-brainer earlier in the 20th century, seems like maybe there's actually flaws in meritocracy. Maybe there's flaws in relying on prestige. And so when we look at what we call democracy today, what I see it as essentially as a sort of guided democracy, the way we talk about Putin's democracy. Putin's democracy is democracy guided by monarchy. Our democracy is democracy guided in the formula that Walter Lippmann came up with about 100 years ago, is democracy guided by prestige, guided by civil society. And I'd like us to address that squarely.
Sure. Professor Allen, just also given time, perhaps if we could focus particularly on what you described as the engineering problems of democracy, which Mr. Yarvin seemed to kind of bring out in the second half.
Well, I know we were also drifting into our second topic there, too, which we're probably getting close to in time.
Yeah.
So I'll just make a very brief comment about Aristotle, because I cannot let it go by having a hash made of Aristotle. That is something I cannot abide.
Again, he did this thing a lot of right-wingers love to do, is you take some aspect of like a holistic political philosophy, you sort of reduce it to some concretized concept, and you attack that narrow concept without really addressing the entire philosophy. So she's going to address that now and sort of like fully flesh out the sort of political philosophy that he was basically strawmanning, and basically describe how it manifests fully and sort of give it the delineation it deserves and how it applies to her political philosophy.
Very fond of Aristotle. So it's really important. Those 6 forms matter a lot in Aristotle: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. The division between the good and bad is the difference between rule for the sake of the people who are ruled versus for the sake of the ruler. And the thing that Aristotle thinks will achieve rule for the sake of the ruler, or rather the rule, the people who are being ruled, and get them good government, is law, limits, and accountability. All right? So that distinction in Aristotle is absolutely critical. The difference is really between tyranny and monarchy, which is a good form because limited, because bound. And monarchies can be limited and bound. Take British constitutional monarchy, take how it developed in the 18th and 19th century. It has produced a form of good rule and good governance for people. Democracy is not the only form that can do that, but limit, rule, those things are necessary and rule of law.
Got it. All right. I think, given where you were going, we could get a little bit into our second topic, which deals directly with Harvard, but it could be interpreted broadly, as Mr. Yarvin was saying, as prestige institutions or civil society. The main question here resolved: Harvard's model of elite formation, grounded in a contested balance between merit and equality, undermines the democratic legitimacy of the political and cultural systems its graduates go on to shape. Now, given how the coin toss went, Mr. Yarvin, you're allowed to see today. What I see it as essentially as a sort of guided democracy, the way we talk about Putin's democracy. Putin's democracy is democracy guided by monarchy. Our democracy is democracy guided in the formula that Walter Lippmann came up with about 100 years ago, is democracy guided by prestige, guided by civil society. And I'd like us to address that squarely. Sure. Professor Allen, just also given time, perhaps if we could focus particularly on what you described as the engineering problems of democracy, which Mr. Yarvin seemed to kind of bring out in the second half.
Well, I know we were also drifting into our second topic there, too, which we're probably getting close to in time. So I'll just make a very brief comment about Aristotle, because I cannot let it go by having a hash made of Aristotle. That is something I cannot abide, because I am very fond of Aristotle. So it's really important. Those 6 forms matter a lot in Aristotle: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. The division between the good and bad is the difference between rule for the sake of the people who are ruled versus for the sake of the ruler. And the thing that Aristotle thinks will achieve rule for the sake of the ruler, or rather the rule, the people who are being ruled, and get them good government, is law, limits, and accountability, all right? So that distinction in Aristotle is absolutely critical. The difference is really between tyranny and monarchy, which is a good form because limited, because bound. And monarchies can be limited and bound. Take British constitutional monarchy, take how it developed in the 18th and 19th century. It has produced a form of good rule and good governance for people. Democracy is not the only form that can do that, but limit, rule, those things are necessary in rule of law.
Got it. All right. I think
So yeah, so his philosophy basically presents the best mode of governance as an absolute monarch who is really unaccountable to any sort of basically tethered force, and he sort of justifies that by positing that humans are not equal. Therefore, if humans are not equal, there must, by virtue of that, be some humans who are better than others. And if some humans are better than others, then those better humans have a more legitimate right to rule than other humans. And their right to rule is innate by virtue of their inequality to other lesser humans, right? So that's basically what you can derive from everything he's been saying all this time. And so Aristotle's political philosophy does posit that there are different classes of humans, right? Like Aristotle lived thousands of years ago. So a massive amount of his book on political philosophy deals with people who are in the slave class versus a sort of more elite caste of human, and sort of he spends a lot of time delineating these basically 2 different classes of human. Now, just because he spends a lot of time on that doesn't mean there aren't useful things to be gleaned from his political work. So as Professor Allen delineated, he does posit different modes of accountability and process that are core to any leadership system, regardless of whether you think a monarchical or democratic system is more viable, And she sort of posited a viable monarchical system, such as the British constitutional monarchy, and how it has worked effectively for a couple of hundred years at this point, right? But and you could argue before then, but I don't think most liberals would argue for a British constitutional monarchy before the sort of ascendance of the parliamentary system. That's probably not somewhere most people are going to go. But the point being, like she said, you need laws, you need process, you need accountability. Any unaccountable leader is eventually going to take actions that are so detrimental to whatever society they're governing that it will lead to basically its effective unraveling, whether that is a complete destruction or just sort of a slow decline, whatever form that takes.
given where you were going, we could get a little bit into our second topic, which deals directly with Harvard, but it could be interpreted broadly, as Mr. Yarvin was saying, as prestige institutions or civil society. The main question here, resolved, Harvard's model of elite formation, grounded in a contested balance between merit and equality, undermines the democratic legitimacy of the political and cultural systems its graduates go on to shape. Now, given how the coin toss went, Mr. Yarvin, you're allowed to speak first.
All right. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, as we say. One of the things I was curious, to sort of see answered in Professor Allen's book, and maybe I didn't see it, but I was sort of curious as to whether Professor Allen's ideal of democracy supports a Harvard admissions department that judges applicants by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. And I think that that's a critically important question for these institutions, because of course when we see Harvard taking the role of elite formation, we're essentially looking at the naked reality of an essentially oligarchic institution. Obviously, Harvard, founded in 1636, is considerably older than the United States of America. And I don't think anyone has ever suggested holding Harvard accountable to voters in any sense. In fact, I think most people at Harvard would be repulsed at the idea of letting elected politicians, soiled by filthy democracy, choose Harvard's admissions department. And I think that that's sort of a reflection on the way that this term democracy has drifted so far from its literal meaning. And of course, Professor Allen is I'm sure, aware that for most of the history of the term democracy, it was considered a negative term. The founders used the term democracy to mean what we now call ochlocracy, essentially, the bad form, ruled by mobs for the mob's own interest, as you might say. And, when I look at, the sort of the way that our system works today, whether it's by the permanent administrative state, which is, like Anthony Fauci, and there are many Faucis out there, is absolutely shielded from democratic accountability. Moreover, attempts to return that to the accountability of the voters under the, complicated and not entirely successful regime of the elected president Donald Trump have been met with really great resistance. And so when I look at this system, I'm basically like, we find the word democracy being used to actually mean oligarchy. And that strikes me as very, very Orwellian. And I would like to...
Okay, so let's tackle a lot of these concepts he's laid out here, right? So again, he's sort of taken the concept of democracy, right, and he's concretized it to even the sort of basest possible form that you could sort of conceptualize it as, which is like mob rule, right? Like a bunch of people just running around in real time, making decisions as to how to enforce the laws, what society's beliefs are, how to, dole out punishment, etc., etc. So obviously, that's such a straw man. It's not even worth contending with, but he does go there. He does lay it out. Again, there's no viable system of democracy that is like direct democracy on every single statute, every single rule, every single possible decision of the state being decided by the broader populace, right? You have to develop mechanisms through which the people's will is manifested and through which sort of experts can effectuate that will in a way that promotes human flourishing. Now, again, he will not really contend with that sort of setup because that undermines his entire belief system and undermines the way he wants the world to be organized. So again, he constructs the straw man, he tears it down without ever addressing the actual things that are posited by Professor Allen or her actual beliefs. So again, we'll see this happen over and over again throughout this debate, but still good to point out every individual instance where it happens that's, salient enough. Is there anything else I want to say here? I think that's enough.
No, what is not Orwellian about that?
Professor Allen?
Well, there is a lot to unpack there, as Mr. Yarvin said. So maybe let's get some facts laid out first, and then we can come to the question of what we should all be hoping for from our great universities. So Massachusetts is, in fact, the actual founder.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So he does set up for another attack he does later, and Professor Allen does rebut one of his points about sort of elite institutions sort of undermining democratic processes and democratic sort of tools that are available to the broader public, right? Because, you have all these institutions who are pumping out people who are sort of like preordained to be leaders by virtue of working in all these bureaucracies that the government has set up that we really don't have a say in, that minimize the impact of each of our votes. So do we really have democracy if that's the case? But again, if you think about what he's implying here, right? Do you really want vaccine approvals to be decided on by a vote by the general public? I don't think so. Even if we were able to take in a decent amount of information about the function and effectiveness of vaccines, you still need a lot of really complex things before deciding whether to roll a vaccine out to the broader public or not. You need randomized controlled trials. You need double-blind studies. You have all these different phases of implementation that require expertise and capital and structured processes that aren't subject to the whims of any sort of segment of the population. So having these things in place doesn't undermine the democratic process, okay? Because the function of democracy isn't democracy for democracy's sake. It is to sort of maximize human flourishing and freedom. And if you have a bunch of disease wiping people out because, you know, you decided to turn over the process of vaccine management to the broader public, I wouldn't say that's exactly a sort of freedom I'd want to live under, you know. So let's, again, get back to her rebuttal at this point.
Founder of Harvard College and has the final authority for Harvard College. And the state legislature directly did take responsibility for Harvard through the middle of the 19th century. So in that regard, one can't say that it's never been the case, that there has been very direct and clear civic connection for Harvard. And to this day, without any question, the university carries a very strong sense of responsibility for its community. Does it always act successfully in relationship to that responsibility? No, it does not. And there is plenty of work for reform internally in our universities. So that's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is about the relationship between universities and democracy more generally. What should be our goals?
So that's just a direct rebuttal to sort of like his attempt to concretize, I guess, that concept by directly refuting the sort of concept of Harvard being unaccountable to anyone. It is, in fact, literally accountable to the state of Massachusetts. But, you know, in the broader context, that's not really super important, but it is just like a funny sort of, you know, factoid that sort of refutes his entire line of attack. But, you know, she's going to make more important points.
What is the history of that? How can we get it right in the present day? The Harvard College was set up in the wake of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, also actually having across its schools established public education, whose main purpose was civic education, and the development of civic strength. The purpose was to make sure that young people understood the laws. Why? Again, to protect freedom so that nobody would be subject to arbitrary treatment because they wouldn't understand the laws. So from the very beginning, the project of education in Massachusetts Bay Colony and the state of Massachusetts ultimately was, again, the project of freedom connected to the structure of the law, and with education institutions having the job precisely of cultivating the kind of civic strength, both of knowledge and relationship, that could support a healthy, self-governing society.
Again, this goes back to a point I made earlier. Like, you can have the most robust political system in the world. If people don't understand how it works, it is effectively useless, you know. Like, you have to understand the mechanisms of the way your society is organized, the political tools at your disposal, the laws that you're subject to, and how to navigate the legal system in terms of the way those laws are implemented. If you don't understand all those things as a populace, maybe not every single individual needs to understand those things, but if the broader populace doesn't have a sort of cogent and viable understanding of all those things, you are sort of surrendering a good part of your power as a citizen in a democracy.
Now, this idea was not just an idea of the colonies. It was also an idea that George Washington was, again, one of the first people to pick up. George Washington wanted to found a national university. And in his aspiration for that university, it would have people from every single state there. That is to say, he sought geographic distribution because his belief was the education that would yield civic strength for a healthy republic, a healthy constitutional democracy, would in fact weave together peoples from across the country. I go through all of this to make the point that the resolution as crafted has a false premise in it. It has in it the premise that egalitarianism and excellence are in tension with each other. They can be, they don't have to be. Excellence and talent are everywhere, and it should be the job of great universities to find that talent wherever it might be. If you didn't find a defense of affirmative action in my book, it's because I have not defended affirmative action. Not now, not over the past 10 years. What I have defended is the idea that universities should have a merit threshold, and above that threshold have a lottery by geographic or socioeconomic categories. So yes, there are lots of different ways to approach the question of how precisely we do admissions, but what is above all important is that as we think about the role of universities in our collective life in this country, the job is, yes, to provide research and knowledge and innovation that support national security, that support economic competitiveness and health, but also that just gives, I'd say, a two-legged bench when we should have a three-legged stool. We also need our universities to cultivate civic strength. That does require our ability to weave relationships on our campuses among all members of our democratic community across all kinds of backgrounds, including differences of viewpoint and perspective. So there's a heck of a lot to say, but without any question, the ability to protect the life of the mind is also central to protecting freedom. That's the work that we have to focus on.
I hear a lot of abstractions there. They're very beautiful abstractions, but
Again, he goes back to this point of attacking the abstractions. Like, she laid out a lot of points there about the mechanisms of, like implementing this democratic impulse at the heart of left liberalism, how you go about ensuring that those sort of impulses are properly served. Very concrete points as to like, hey, you need an educated populace, you need power to be distributed in a certain way, you need people to understand the way laws work and how they affect them as individuals, and sort of have a good understanding of their role within the sort of socio-political context. He will not contend with any of that because he cannot. If he does, it will sort of undermine his entire political philosophy, his entire argument. Now, you could make an argument that there are ways that he could address it while positing that his political philosophy is superior. But the problem he has is that there are no good examples on Earth right now where his political philosophy is proven to be superior. Like, by any metric, look at a country like Russia or the Middle East monarchies. Despite all those countries having vast oil reserves, I don't think you could say any of them have superior political or socioeconomic outcomes to any sort of liberal democracy, especially sort of left of center oriented liberal democracy.
In order to make some of the history concrete, let me tell a brief history story here. Does anyone in the room recognize the name Robert Califf? Back room, we got one way in the back with the beanie. All right, what about the name Increase Mather? What about the name Cotton Mather? There we go. Cotton Mather has and as a failed child prodigy myself, I have enormous respect for this. Cotton Mather, besides being the son of Increase Mather, Harvard president, was actually the youngest person ever to matriculate at Harvard, and he entered Harvard at the age of 11. He was generally recognized as a genius. He was also the son of the president of Harvard. They respected, heredity in those days as well. Cotton Mather expected to become the president of Harvard, but he never did. And here is why, which is that, are you familiar with the Salem witch trials? So it turns out that the Salem witch trials were, an epiphenomenon of Puritanism. We've all heard the phrase, till the stock of the Puritans fail, was an epiphenomenon of the radical Puritanism that erupted in Massachusetts after the end of the Dominion of New England, the overthrow of James II and of Governor Andros. And many, phenomena that were, very strange and bizarre, such as the belief in witchcraft, the idea of what was called spectral evidence, really flourished in New England at this time. Of course, Harvard was quite an old institution at that time. And the way in which the witch craze ended was really remarkable. It was due to this one man, Robert Califf, who was a merchant. He was not an academic. He was basically a citizen of Boston, and he was like, this is crazy. And he wrote a book called More Wonders of the Invisible World, which is a commentary on Mather's book, Wonders of the Invisible World, which is all about the action of demons. He could not get this book published in Massachusetts. He had it published in England, and it was brought back to Massachusetts, and there, I think in the year, sometime in the 1690s, I forget the exact date, that book was burned in Harvard Yard by Cotton Mather. And yet, basically, Harvard's ideal of veritas, truth, seems to be much more important than all of the other ideals Professor Allen has regarded put together. And I think the lesson of Robert Califf, who brought about the end of the witch craze single-handedly by standing up and speaking the truth and being unpopular, being canceled, as you might say, was that he was like, you know what? Actually, I believe in Harvard's ideals more strongly than Harvard does at the moment. And I will basically come to Harvard, I will come to the people of Massachusetts, and I will try to restore these ideals. And the witch craze ended. Cotton Mather attempted to sort of spin it. And he was like, oh, I was really a moderate witch hunter. I didn't believe in spectral evidence in all cases. But his reputation was permanently tarnished as a result of the witch trials, and he never became president of Harvard. And so, I find that very inspiring in a way, because I see that these fundamentally aristocratic and completely non-democratic institutions are actually capable of that level of self-renewal. And that's what I hope for. That's what I hope to see when I come to Harvard or another university of similar reputation, is that I hope to see that genius for self-renewal there. And I think that genius has to sort of contend against the corruption of the immense power that Harvard has and its immense ability to set public policy. And I think that power has corrupted the mission of truth. Professor Allen.
So there's a lot there. So again, he's taking a lot of abstract concepts and sort of conflating them Well, I guess he's sort of positing a sort of applied case of this sort of philosophy of belief in, I guess, expertise class within a democratic context. That you can have people that take certain items to be effectively articles of faith, claim that they have evidence backing them up, create a whole sort of body of literature, sort of reinforcing this belief. And it could all just be built on a foundation of lies being burnished by these people's credentials. Now, the witch trials are a sort of perfect sort of analogy for this, I guess, situation, because like they were in fact perpetuated a lot by elites or like members of the expert class. There were in fact a lot of concrete observations you could make that would totally refute these witch trials or witch hunts or whatever. And it could be refuted by a single outsider willing to look at the plain evidence in front of their eyes. So it is an interesting sort of analogy to use for this concept of abstract belief based on, your political philosophy. But again, he doesn't really contend with anything Professor Yarvin believes or that she posits in any of her work. He is standing up a straw man, this time in the form of an analogy, because most of the things that a left liberal democratic framework have tools for measuring the outcomes and how closely the way society ends up based on expected outcomes. Like they correlate pretty strongly in a way that there never was with any of the witch trials, like a lot of metrics, sure, they don't correlate perfectly with what you want to see in society, but they are pretty good cognates for things that enable the sort of outcomes people will tend to want in a democratic society.
Well, I think you'd find much agreement that the spirit of renewal is to be welcomed on our campus and on other campuses. I think that's not a controversial point. And the question really is what the work is to be done. It seems to me that America's universities do need a new social contract with the people of America. And there are a few elements to that. For starters, it is important that as a part of working on that renewal, we also all recognize the importance of defending academic freedom, freedom of inquiry, and the private rights, constitutional rights of civil society institutions. I will use that phrase, civil society, universities being anchor to the fabric of civil society, and civil society being, in fact, the space for freedom. And as we work on...
Okay, and the funny thing is, despite his assertion, a core tenet of Professor Allen's belief in political philosophy and a core tenet of any left liberal system is this concept of reassessing based on where society is. If we discover new things that we believe align more closely with reality or more closely with the truth, then we reassess where the boundaries of our political philosophy or sort of political beliefs lie, and that is a constantly occurring process. And his sort of assertion that there are certain things that you take for gospel and don't really question them because they come from these scions who are undemocratically appointed by virtue of some perceived meritocratic process, they don't really gel with the implementation of any sort of left liberal or even other liberal philosophies. So it's kind of a funny assertion that flies in the face of one of the core tenets of Professor Allen's work.
Defending those things, then their question is where also do we need to work on renewal? We have fallen short, I would say, because of the problem of technocracy. The problem of technocracy is the problem of expertise disconnected from real realities, what people are experiencing, and without the humility that goes with making recommendations for the world at large, the inability to test them appropriately with the full range of stakeholders and perspectives. That is something that we do need to improve on without any question. We also certainly need to improve on our ability to provide.
I don't really think Curtis Yarvin addressed this in a good faith manner, but this is as good a point of any for her to address this concept, right? Like this concept of needing technocratic individuals that are in certain strata of society, whether they are in fact, in government, academic institutions, or other aspects that basically align with sort of things that we would consider to be the public intellectual space or the public sector, right? We do have this expert class either within the government that aren't directly elected or within academia who sort of define a lot of the broad cross sections by which we govern different sectors of society. And they can sort of fall out of step with the broader societal context. So just because you need to realign them with where people are, with the context in which we all exist, if they end up getting a bit separated by virtue of just sort of existing in this space that can become an echo chamber, doesn't mean that you need to sort of scrap them. You just need to expand what informs those spaces and those mechanisms that we use to define the parameters in which we exist in society as a general public. Again, attacking one of these straw men that he set up and will probably expound on later. I don't remember off the top of my head. We do need institutions of expertise. Like if you go to a doctor, they are certified by a board of other doctors who are effectively a private organization. And we don't really have a say as individuals as to what the parameters that they use to determine whether you are indeed a certified doctor are. But we trust them to pool their expertise and take into account the needs of society at large to determine what those parameters are that constitute the certification one needs to become a doctor. So we do need those in spaces that are considered political because you do need some degree of technocratic expertise. You cannot have politics operate purely either within a populist space or within an authoritarian space. You need a bureaucracy for any complex society.
Opportunity and to establish clarity that there's fairness in our procedures for admission. I've already alluded to my own approach I've been arguing for more than a decade. But with regard to opportunity, we have to tackle the problem of cost. I believe we ought to be experimenting with 3-year degrees instead of 4-year degrees, which would bring the expense burden down considerably, quite rapidly for families. We would also be able to have more people come to campus if we were able to deliver an education in 3 years. And that would give us the opportunity both to serve more, but also to connect more broadly across the fabric of our country and our society. And then lastly, I'll repeat myself.
Sorry. Again, she's outlining concrete points that exist within her political philosophy. Like, even though the philosophy consists of a lot of abstractions, those abstractions manifest in concrete ways of addressing issues people have in society. So, like, with this issue of like stratified base of expertise, you have real world things that you can do to address that. If institutions become too entrenched or too insular, you have ways that you can open it up that don't consist of either completely decommissioning or relegating them to sort of irrelevance. Like, there are incremental steps you can take to align institutions more closely with your goals that you have society, or to modernize them if they were previously in alignment and become out of alignment as time passes and new systems and new ways of organizing society arise, or new problems that need to be solved arise. So again, he is building straw man upon straw man. And notice that he's also not particularly defending his political philosophy. So the vast majority of the fighting we've done in this debate has been purely on the grounds of Professor Allen's political philosophy. And this is a situation you end up in if you exist in the left liberal spectrum in any way pretty often, because there are so many points to attack left liberalism from, since so many of the institutions of the modern world are built upon a liberal philosophy in a way that tends to lean toward the left, because you are going to tend more towards building massive institutions with a left liberal philosophy than a right liberal philosophy. And there are ways in which these institutions have become sclerotic and stagnated that make them easy to attack. Like, it's very strange to be a left liberal and to be viewed as a sort of reinforcing the status quo, because, you know, like a lot of people associate liberalism with progressivism. Now, I don't call myself a progressive. There are many reasons for that. I'll probably detail that at another time when I just sort of get more into just talking about my political philosophy in general, or left liberalism as a political philosophy. But left liberalism relies on institutions, relies on expertise, relies on sort of ways to objectivize a lot of these abstract concepts in ways that they can manifest in actual outcomes in the real world that align with the goals of the philosophy of left liberalism. There's a lot of fertile ground on which we can be attacked. And again, there are not too many instances of Curtis Yarvin's philosophy that exist in the real world right now, but that's because the vast majority of them have lost effectively to this liberal worldview. It's proven to be a more effective mode of governance, better outcomes, stronger countries. And since it's become so dominant, it's become a lot easier to attack because it's sort of become the water that we're all swimming in, to take a metaphor that a lot of people have used to describe liberalism recently, since it's come under such attack. Again, she is providing concrete examples of how to implement this abstract philosophy that he refuses to contend with. And we'll see him continue to do that throughout this debate.
I think we really have to be able to educate for civic strength, and that means beginning the picture of our education, our work, by recognizing that our context and our goal is to be oriented by the ideal of pluralism. We are a pluralistic society. We bring to our campus people from all backgrounds, of all kinds. We're diverse in our identities and our ideologies. And in that context, the goal is to develop a culture where we're capable of civil disagreement, mutual learning, hard and difficult discussions across lines of difference, and able to cultivate, I would argue for, a culture of mutual commitment to one another, holding each other with mutual respect, but also shared commitment to constitutional democracy, constitutionalism, rule of law, nonviolence, and full inclusion. So that is all work I think we need to do to establish a new social contract between ourselves, Harvard, and the rest of America's universities, and the American people.
Perhaps on the point of technocracy.
So a lot of the points she made there require you to sort of accept this sort of liberal framework and accept its utility and its effectiveness as a mode of governance. Now, we all sort of implicitly accept this because that despite Trump's attempts to unravel and dismantle this mode of governance, it is effectively, like I said earlier, the water that we are all swimming in. It would be very hard for someone to effectively defect from the system of organization, without inducing major conflict or conflagration. Curtis Yarvin is attempting to undermine this mode of governance, this political philosophy, and its viability, but he's doing it as an outsider, as someone who exists within this context, but has to contend with the realities of existing within that context while at the same time wanting to tear it down. A lot of his arguments are going to sort of come from that perspective. And he sort of does that by taking these abstract concepts, concretizing them via straw man, and knocking down those straw men, because that's one of the most effective ways to contend with the fact that you exist within a system that you want to destroy.
Within prestigious institutions like Harvard.
Sure. Well, I don't believe in pluralism. I believe in veritas. And to the extent that, pluralism...
So a lot of right-wingers will do this thing where they take this concept of the truth, or objective truth, objective reality, right? So there's a difference between something being objective and something being concrete. And concretizing something doesn't make it real. Right. You just want to take an abstract concept, analogize it to something that exists in the physical world, and tear down that analogy. So that's what this concept of concretizing consists of, right? So even though you're employing this rhetorical tool to sort of take an abstract concept and manifest it in the real world in some way and say, hey, look, they're using all these fancy words to say this thing, and it's really just a house of cards because, look, I have sort of like laid it out in plain language and shown it for the canard that it is, when they haven't really done that. They've just analogized it in a way that makes it easy to tear down that sort of poor analogy and posit it as something that is misaligned with what you can see with your own two eyes, i.e. the truth or objective reality, objective truth, whatever you want to call this concept. This is what a lot of them do. Like, Curtis Yarvin, Warren Smith, other people in this sort of right-wing intellectual space. And when they sort of deal with left liberal ideologies.
Between truth and error is no pluralism at all. On the subject of pluralism, though, I would say that there's a line from Burke in that a constitution is a contract between the dead and the living. And one of the things that we see basically in our own time, and one of the things I was very shocked to discover by just getting into a lot of the primary reading ourselves, is the immense narrowing in the set of permissible political and social perspectives that has taken place not just in this country over the last 10 or 20 years, but over the last 100, 200, 300 years. There are many, many perspectives that are simply...
So this is interesting because he is effectively a monarchist, right? Like, he believes in absolute rule by singular leader who will sort of guide the unwashed masses into the glorious future, right? And he sort of has to launder this philosophy in a way that makes it palatable to people who've existed in a democratic context, right? He's not purely attempting to preach the choir here. People are already true believers in his beliefs. So he's sort of constructing all these sort of rhetorical tools to make his worldview more palatable to people who are used to existing in a sort of democratic Republican context. When I say Democratic Republican, I'm not referring to the political parties. I mean a democratic republic, So a democracy wherein you have all these guardrails and structures and processes to sort of transmute the will of the people as expressed through the democratic process into positive outcomes that they are sort of basically selecting elected leaders as a proxy for. And so he wants to get rid of all these proxies. He wants to get rid of all these, institutions and systems and abstractions, and just have rule by the worthy and using whatever metric he, deems as useful to select who's worthy. And funny thing about that is that he doesn't acknowledge the bias that he has in creating those metrics in the first place. He's not even really laying out those metrics. He's just attempting to poke holes in the concepts that undergird the metrics that people on the left liberal side of the spectrum use, because the only way he can make his philosophy palatable to most people is by weakening, again, the context they already exist in. Because he knows that if he were to plainly state his political philosophy in clear and easy language, most people would find it odious. So again, the only thing you have to do to make your political philosophy more viable as a right-wing authoritarian is to destroy the credibility of the dominant political context that people already exist in.
No longer represented in this world that were, I think of... the trial of Julius Evola after World War II, where he said he was charged for his convictions, and he said, my convictions are only what everyone considered right and natural before the French Revolution. And I don't really see the convictions of...
It's funny because the French Revolution is core to sort of our modern modes of political organization. The French Revolution is where this sort of the full manifestation of the modern concept of liberalism as a political philosophy takes root. We technically do have liberalism as a political concept way before then. Some people would say with the founding of the United States, minus slavery, just that little note there. But they don't really like fully outline this concept of liberalism. It's not until the French Revolution that we get like liberalism as a like self-contained political ideology, and then this concept of right versus left, you know, within that philosophy, within that political ideology. And you know, maybe we'll get into that another point, but there have already been a lot of pretty good treatises on this concept of liberalism and right versus left. Some of my favorite ones are by YouTuber Ryan Getty, so you can go check his channel out if you want more information about that. I'm not sure what video in particular I'd most recommend off the top of my head, but I believe he has a video basically that's labeled as being about the French Revolution in some way, so that would be the best one to get started with.
Julius Evola or Joseph de Maistre, you know, well represented at Harvard, which is not a problem if they're erroneous. But if they're not erroneous, then there is indeed a problem. And in terms of the, you know, the question of technocracy and the sort of the effect of power on Harvard, I'd like to come back to this case of COVID because I think it actually tells us an enormous amount about the way our society is governed. I would say that COVID, you know, really is sending us the same message about the way we are governed that Chernobyl sent to the Soviet Union, except it killed a lot more people than Chernobyl. We can't really ignore the fact that virology invented COVID. We can't really ignore the fact that the best virology.
So again, here we go. Here's a common right-wing trope that they use to sort of undermine this edifice of sort of technocratic governance within a democratic context, right? Oh, like COVID was made in a lab, even though like the preponderance of evidence at this point points to COVID having originated in the wild or in a wet market. And you can view like an 18-hour debate by a guy named Peter Miller effectively outlining how it's basically almost impossible that COVID originated in a lab. He like literally traces step by step each step of figuring out where the first cases came from and how we determined that, and putting to bed this whole lab leak theory. They like to use this COVID lab leak theory and this active belief that it was ironically engineered using gain-of-function research to fight coronaviruses, but in the end we created the worst coronavirus outbreak in modern history, you know, which is not true. Again, you can take a look at that around 18-hour debate by Peter Miller, sort of debunking all the most common and worst tropes of this lab leak theory. But again, the reason why it persists is because it's one of the most effective modes of attack on this concept of technocratic expertise within a democratic context. It's a useful tool for them. Even though, ironically, I think most of the failures from COVID were from, at least within the US, were from Trump trying to manage the disease in a sort of imperious manner. He undermined the experts at every turn. You know, it's not like we got everything right from the outset, but it's a novel disease. You have to do a lot of experimentation. You have to see how it operates in the real world and come up with tools to counter it. And Trump did do Operation Warp Speed, which fast-tracked the vaccines. So I guess some people do want to give him credit for that. I don't really. And he ended up backtracking on his support for the vaccines because guess what? All his supporters hate the vaccines. So didn't even end up being that useful for his political purposes, ironically. So, yeah.
The top virologists, both created it and covered it up. And when we look at the cause of that, blaming individuals, scapegoating individuals, you know, saying, oh, this is Fauci's fault, I don't believe that at all. I believe that it is actually a fault of the system. And what I observe of this system is that it is essentially the way that science is governed in the post-war society is to say, okay, here you're a scientist, you're not here to just be abstractly curious, you're here to solve a problem. And what they wound up doing when saying, scientists, you're here to solve a problem, is that they created a culture of grantsmanship, where a virologist, you know, is out there to say, wow, there's a very serious problem, and I deserve public funds for solving this problem. And that went from SARS-1 being a serious problem to saying, oh, well, more coronaviruses could mutate to become dangerous, you know, viruses.
again, this whole gain of function line of attack is complete bullshit. Like, so many people have addressed this already. But I want to pause to talk about this point in particular. A lot of people like to use this attack on scientific mainstream as being oriented around grants for the sake of getting grants, just handing out money to people to do things, and you end up with all these either useless studies that are just there to keep the funding flowing, or you end up with people doing dangerous things to sort of push the boundary to sort of try to discover something new. And those two assertions are sort of in contradictory with one another, so I'd like to know how a lot of these people square that. Although I guess you could say that, different people are asserting these two different attacks on the sort of modern scientific institution. But I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of the type of people who attack scientific research from those points of view. Anyway.
To saying, well, let's mutate these viruses ourselves to kind of help them along to show what could happen accidentally in nature. And so they sort of, transgressed from basically being there to cure viruses to being there to create viruses. And then they realized early in 2020, and if you look at their Slack messages, you'll see this, they realized very clearly that it was very likely that this had come out of Wuhan. Yes, it was a Chinese experiment, but it was actually a Western, sort of research project. And then they made this very, very culpable decision to really behave in an essentially criminal way and cover that up. And so when you look at the incentives of experts, I want to sort of go back and say, again, you have these three forms of governance. You have authority, governance by command, by domination, as Professor Allen would say. You have governance by prestige, and you have governance by popularity. And the initial progressives who established this system, in 1900, the idea of professors setting public policy was unheard of. And people looked at the result of actual democracy, where elected politicians set policy, and they were like, this is corrupt, this is incompetent. Everything people say about Donald Trump, they said about William McKinley. They may be a little more right about Trump than they were.
Okay, so back then, there were a lot of politicians who would literally just take bribes to implement policy. So they were, in fact, corrupt, okay? Like, there was this, just open culture of naked corruption in the post-Civil War era that resulted in a lot of bad outcomes and resulted in the domination of society by robber barons who did, in fact, have almost monarchical power over society. So this is the sort of society he wants. So, it's not surprising to see him sort of burnish the legacy of William McKinley. And maybe you could sort of put Howard Taft and, of course, Donald Trump within this sort of same wheelhouse. But yeah, it's funny to see him downplay this very real issue of corruption in the post-Civil War era. So yeah, again, we know where he's coming from, but the examples he chooses or the way he either supports his worldview or attacks the opposing view are sort of, it's interesting the way they lay bare how he wants the world to be organized.
About McKinley, I wouldn't say that. But yeah, they looked at American aristocrats of the period, looked at the Gilded Age. They looked at what was called the Great Barbecue. They looked at the idea, okay, this is real democracy. If you put elected politicians in charge of the government, that's the literal word democracy. And they were like, this is terrible. And who can save us from this? And so, the answer of a king wasn't available to them at that time. And so they're like, all right, what if we put the professors in charge? What if we put the experts in charge? What if we put the old aristocrats in charge? What if we put the smartest people in charge? And this seemed absolutely infallible to them. And they did not realize how much that exercise of power would in fact corrupt these people to the point where it basically led essentially well-meaning non-evil virologists to invent a pandemic that killed 20 million people.
So this is a crazy stretch, right? So he's taking this sort of concept of technocratic expertise, sort of first pioneered by Theodore Roosevelt, bringing in academics from different fields to guide policy making to, effectively lead to the outcomes he wanted, like cleaner air, cleaner water, cleaner environment, more viable economic policies, antitrust policies that he really pioneered with the Sherman Antitrust Act, sort of the first real big breakups of these large monopolies that had come to loom large over American society, like I said, in a monarchical way. Like, these people effectively had more power than the US president. And, even with Theodore Roosevelt's efforts, they would continue to dominate society all the way up through the presidency of FDR, who would go further in this direction of sort of creating an expert bureaucratic class with initially with his New Deal policies, and then establishing all these boards and commissions that regulate stock trading, regulate food and water, all these different tools to prevent the worst deprivations of private actors. And also, these people never really contend with a balance of power between the government and private actors, right? I'll get more into this later. I do have an entire breakdown I want to do, but let's try to get through this. So yeah, that's one thing they fail to contend with. The government does have to counteract the will of private actors who would despoil off society for a profit, and that's not necessarily saying that they're evil. Just like he asserted that, Fauci and all these bureaucrats aren't evil. They are just exercising power in the system where they've been given too much of it. I don't really see the evidence for that, but there is very real evidence of societal deprivation at the hand of the sort of a permanent robber baron class that's existed in the post-Civil War era. And of course, they've had various degrees of power, and the government has reined them in various iterations. But that is always a very real threat that we have to contend with as a society, that too much power ends up in the hands of very few, very powerful people who own these large corporations that dictate vast swaths of social organization.
And then cover it up. And I think that lesson exists across the board in all of these areas of public policy. I view the Ukraine war as a tragedy very, very similar to the tragedy of COVID. It's basically unaccountable public policy on, with nothing to stop it. And the fact that these
It's funny. This is one area where you see a lot of overlap between the far left and the far right. There are a lot more, but this is one that he brings up that is pretty easy to get into. This concept of the Ukraine war having basically been engineered by U.S. foreign policy and NATO and its expansionist ambitions, as opposed to the autocratic designs of Vladimir Putin, who's attacked plenty of his neighbors who were former Soviet bloc countries before this, even the 2014 invasion in Ukraine, attacking Chechnya, Georgia, believe Lithuania, I might be wrong on that, but he's attacked plenty of former Eastern Bloc countries and undermined their sovereignty or created these little autonomous carve-outs prior to even the 2014 Ukraine investigation and then the full-scale investigation in February of 2021.
Structures are oligarchic and based on prestige rather than authority do not mean that they do not have power and do not mean that they do not have the power to misgovern.
Are professors in charge? Is his standard for what makes a professor, is that right? Those sorts of questions.
Well, we know for a fact professors aren't in charge because, obviously. But anyway, I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to go back to the very beginning of that set of remarks when Mr. Yarvin suggested that pluralism and veritas are in conflict with each other. That's not the case. To protect freedom is to generate diversity of thought. James Madison said that. Old idea, others have said it as well. And so to protect freedom and is to generate precisely what you need in order to pursue veritas, namely the conflict of ideas required for competitive consideration of hard questions that are rarely given to certain conclusions. So in that regard, actually pluralism is something that helps advance the cause of veritas. Respecting pluralism and protecting pluralism is beneficial to the project of discovery. The project of discovery always benefits from adversarial structures and competitive structures. And so yes, there's always room for the enterprise of science to improve itself. And no, the professors are certainly not in charge, but who can deny that expertise brings with it a certain kind of power? But again, it's a very specific kind of power. And the question is, how does it sit in relationship to other kinds of power? There, I think the best way of understanding what our goal should be is actually to go back to Aristotle, who gave us a
So it's kind of disappointing that she doesn't directly address the lab leak theory, which I guess it's a good impulse for her. Like, she's an actual academic, and actual academics tend not to opine on things that are outside their area of expertise, which is generally a good thing. But in a setting like this, even if you have minimal knowledge as to how COVID originated and spread, you can do pretty effective 1 or 2 sentence counters to the assertion that it almost certainly came from a lab and was the result of so-called gain of function research. Like, there are pithy, easy rebuttals that you can make to that assertion. But again, I understand the impulse on her part not to do that, especially if she doesn't really have the details on how best to address it. Yeah, she also addresses his point of sort of this inherent power granted to the sort of professorial class. There is a reason why you want to control mainstream narratives in academic fields. That's why you see a lot of right-wingers invest in economics to sort of ensure that their economic theories become more prevalent, because the field of economics is vastly dominated by economic theories that one would consider to be more sympathetic to the left side of the political spectrum. But yeah, this idea that professors innately have this power over civil society by virtue of their academic authority, plus this matriculation into the actual federal government through the agencies, it's a pretty bold and, I'd say, specious claim. But he addresses it a little bit, with a bit of a pithy remark. But I don't think there's any way you could defend that with actually decent examples. But yeah.
Beautiful account of the different kinds of knowledge and expertise that people bring to bear. So again, when he's talking about his different regime types, partly the different regime types also put different kinds of knowledge offerings on the shared table of society. So the people bring things in particular. They bring clarity about values for society. They also bring clarity about their desire to play a role and for what reasons they have for flourishing. The oligarchy category in the ancient sense brings clarity about honor and privileges and rights and things like that. And then in Aristotle's account, the monarchs are those who do bring that trained expertise. Society can generate these things differently in a variety of different ways, but the point is we need all of it. We do actually need the clarity about values that come from the perspective of ordinary people. We also need trained expertise. We also need to ensure that the pathway to participating in that world of trained expertise is broadly open, and that is a competitive pathway, and that the work that comes out of it is developed in competitive and adversarial structures of engagement. So at any rate, that was a mouthful, I realize, but no, in general, professors are not in charge, but expertise and ordinary knowledge, the knowledge of common people, can work well together when we build the right structures for pulling them together.
Yeah, so she says a lot there, but her main assertion, which is that expertise is not in direct contrast with democratic ideals, is correct. There is room for input from the populace in these sort of expert bureaucracies or defining the outcomes that we want to prioritize through these bureaucracies. But that does not eliminate the need for these bureaucracies. That doesn't eliminate the need for all this expertise. Even before modern liberal democracies, you had vast bureaucratic institutions under authoritarian monarchies. There is no complex modern society that can operate without massive bureaucracy. Now, what he's really arguing over here is who is in charge of that bureaucracy and how the desires of society at large are reflected through those bureaucracies. And I don't think he does a good job of asserting how society would function without those, but that's not his goal really. he doesn't want those bureaucracies to not exist. He just wants them to be fully under the control of an authoritarian leader. And the best way to sort of lay fertile ground for that to happen is to discredit this system of bureaucracies to begin with. Again, with the hope of not destroying them, but repurposing them for an authoritarian system.
Let me hone in. It seems like I feel like this debate has been a success because we've honed in on what I would say is the most important point, which is essentially the functioning of the marketplace of ideas. And the marketplace of ideas, when it works well, is essentially a Darwinian system in which good ideas, exactly, I don't like using the word that starts with a D, but in which you have a variety of ideas, like mutations in a Darwinian system, and it's the survival of the fittest. And those systems work well when the definition of fittest is actually the definition that you want. And the essential problem, when you have scientists kind of puttering around in their laboratories, breeding beans with other beans, and they're like, look, wow, it works like this. The fittest ideas in that, bucolic condition of 19th century science are simply the truest ideas. You are evolving, you are selecting for veritas. When I look at the way that expertise has worked in the 20th century, ever since public policy started being dictated by ideas at Harvard, what I see is actually very different from that. And again, I'm going to use virology as an example. Within virology, the Robert Califfs of virology did exist before COVID. And there were actually people who very bravely stood up and said, no, you should not be doing gain-of-function research. There is actually nothing to be gained from gain-of-function research. We found that actually nothing was gained at all from this research when COVID was created. They're like, we're going to predict these emergences of viruses. Okay, you predicted it. It happened. Now what? Did you learn anything? No, you didn't. Right. And actually, what you find is that what you're evolving for in the basic...
Now, the irony of this is, one, nobody has proved that COVID emerged from a lab as a result of this gain-of-function research. The preponderance of evidence points to COVID emerging from the wet market in a sort of crossover event from a wild coronavirus from another species. That is where the preponderance of evidence points. And then the irony of his assertion here is that the vaccine was derived from research into mRNA delivery vehicles that had been happening, especially with respect to coronaviruses, for over a decade prior. So the solution to the COVID pandemic came from research that had been happening for over a decade prior to COVID coming into existence, and therefore we were sort of able to bootstrap the solution onto this existing body of work, and the cause is something that is inconvenient to his political goals. So he goes with the sort of mechanism of spread that is most conducive to what he wants the political outcomes to be in the world, which is that we vest all power in a singular authoritarian leader who is worthy in some sort of like Ubermensch formulation of the world.
The system of grant-funded science is science that gets more grants. And so gain-of-function, imagine being a biologist who's against gain-of-function research. You were not a team player. You were trying to deny grants to all of your friends. You were saying, don't work on this.
Again, and here's another trope that these people love to assert about the scientific community, okay? Science is an enterprise that's practiced in every country on the planet, okay? There is no like one international science institution that they all report to. They are all competing with one another. If a country was hamstringing itself by sort of imposing this like edifice of scientific consensus that's unresponsive to the real world over its institutions, it would fall behind very quickly. And ironically, you are seeing Donald Trump sort of attempt to pursue this by dictating what research can and can't be funded using public funds. And we are going to fall behind in mRNA research. We are going to fall behind in other fields that he doesn't deem worthy by virtue of his right-wing political philosophy. So, ironically, what he's asserting about the broader scientific consensus, the broader scientific community, is more true about the approach to politics that aligns with his worldview than it is the one he's attacking. So, like, it's and this is something that you're gonna encounter throughout sort of dealing with right wing political philosophies. Like, there are all these contradictions, all these assertions that they make that they don't really have to contend with, because all institutions that reflected their worldview have basically ceased to exist as dominant forces on the planet because they were inferior. They were inferior modes of organization. They were inferior ways of trying to create the most productive society that you can, the societies with the most flourishing that you can, the societies that are best organized for the broadest cross sections of people that you can. So again, like, we will see all of these rhetorical tools employed to legitimize his worldview while not really contending with the implications of what he's asserting, because he does not have to. He just has to poison the water that we are currently swimming in.
And they're basically saying, look, but I have this beautiful research that I'm doing, and it's explained by this idea that sort of the 1918 flu should be a problem. So let's go and reinvent the 1918 flu. Actually, I forget the name, but something very disturbing happened in the supposedly anti-academic Trump administration, which is, I think, the deputy head of NIAID, the Infectious Diseases Institute, is actually the gain-of-function guy who recreated the 1918 flu, which hasn't gotten out and hurt us yet, but very well might. And so, when I look at this, I'm like, wow, if the professors aren't in charge, even electing Donald Trump doesn't seem to have stopped the gain-of-function, basically, world. What I see is the gain of...
Again, here he's asserting that electing a leader who aligns with his worldview of this sort of monarchical mode of governance should give them the ability to sort of wrest all of these institutions under their direct control. Like, that would be a terrifying world if it were fully implemented in the way he envisions. If they have attempted so far in this administration to grind all these institutions effectively to a halt and to sort of reorient them in a way that aligns entirely with their right-wing authoritarian worldview. They have had significant success in defunding a lot of research, destroying USAID, undermining the IRS, deleting the Department of Education. Like, the examples go down the list. But because they have not been 100% successful in their goals, they basically effectively view it as still being the old system, because they haven't managed to completely destroy it, despite having undermined so many aspects of it that we rely on from day to day in ways that aren't completely visible. And they take advantage of that lack of visibility, like this concept of excess deaths. Like, the manifestations of what they're doing are not going to tend to be cataclysmic, catastrophic, easily perceivable ruin and despoilation in the society. It's going to manifest in a million little sort of deprivations that are imperceptible to the public at large. It's just going to kill one person here, shorten one person's lifespan there, increase accidents by this mechanism here. You aren't typically going to have manifestations like we had with plane crashes or planes falling out of the sky early in the Trump administration when they undermined the FAA. And even those, they may not be like 100% correlative, but the sort of juxtaposition of them attacking the FAA and then all of a sudden having these typical flight disasters is a pretty strong sort of metaphor for what they want to do and the results, even if there isn't a one-to-one correlation. But even with those examples, like, we're not really seeing a complete revolt against what they're trying to do, because there is a strong base of support. They have propagandized a significant percentage of the population to believe what they're doing will result in the most flourishing for them and the people who they deem worthy.
Function research, like so many other research programs, has a built-in bureaucratic advantage because it generates funding. And there are so many basically directions in research and public policy where it is not the direction of veritas, that wins. It is the direction of, if you'll excuse my Latin, monetas. And that money is not, it's not corporate,
And again, like, this is such a crazy assertion. If all these scientists wanted to earn money, they would just exist purely within the private sector, right? They're not all these government scientists who are there to earn the biggest bag they possibly can. If they wanted the biggest bag, they would be working for oil companies, petroleum, materials companies. They would be working in very different fields than the vast majority of government or educational institution affiliated scientists work in. Like, this bag that he's talking about is virtually non-existent relative to what exists in the private sector.
bribery or whatever. It's just the fact that everyone in science, and this is, by the way, the reason that I personally dropped out of science, is that I realized that to be a good scientist today,
Again, this is another common trope. Like, you see this with a lot of tech oligarchs. You see this with a lot of sort of science disinformation spreaders. Oh, I was an insider, or oh, I was on the path to entering this field, but I saw how corrupt it was. Like, I got out so I could warn you that all these people in the mainstream scientific body are actually just out there to collect piles of cash. They're not trying to make the world better. They're not trying to discover the truth. They're just, basically engaging in this massive circle jerk to burn cash as fast as they can, doing like whatever they want and maintaining this hegemony over our society that can't be questioned, which is complete bullshit under any sort of basic interrogation. But it's just such a potent rhetorical tool for this sort of like, I guess, authoritarian populism, because, he's, even within this authoritarian system, he's still sort of like deriving authority from some form of popular consensus. Whether he's asserting like a certain class of people have a right to rule, the broader society has to acknowledge that right, even if he's asserting it to be innate or a feature of the physical world, as objective truth. Like, ironically, he still has to derive legitimacy in a way that he would probably describe as abstract, even though he's presenting it as being a concrete feature of the universe.
An effective PI in the system, you have to be an empire builder. And like, I'm just not an empire builder. It's just not me, right? And so what we have is this generation of very effective bureaucrats, the Fauci.
Yeah. So he's saying he's not an empire builder, but he does want to live in an empire erected by someone else who aligns with his political philosophy. And in order to do that, he has to assert the current system as an illegitimate empire that needs to be torn down and have something new erected in its place. Again, this is a more abstract, a more metaphorical straw man. But again, you build up a straw man, you tear it down to legitimize your philosophy over and over again. Like, you see it happen over and over again, and you just have to have the tools to spot it when you see it.
The Ralph Barracks, the Peter Daszaks, the people who really honestly right now should be in jail for what they did. And instead have suffered little or no harm. EcoHealth Alliance, which basically ran, the research program under Peter Daszak, was disbarred, or, they can't get grants anymore. Peter Daszak is like, fine, we'll shut it down. We'll start a new organization, different name, should be fine. Like, actually, these people seem profoundly unaccountable. And if you look at the processes that gave them power, and really the power to create COVID, they seem very, very corrupt. And I see essentially many, many things, who benefits from expansion of NATO to the east? Well,
so again, he's taking these like anecdotal situations, broad concepts, taping them together by like some, like, I don't know, some mode of construction that he's created in his own mind, expecting you to sort of like take him at his word, or believe that you can do your own research, put things together, and come to your own conclusion that pretty much aligns with exactly where he wants you to go, and, think you've stumbled onto, again, some objective truth. Like, it's really quite crazy if you stop to think about it, but it is an effective rhetorical strategy. It does work on a lot of people, especially those who are predisposed to his worldview. And, anyone will sort of try to maximally burnish what their perspective is. But I'd like to think that most people on the left liberal spectrum do not attempt to do it in this extremely bad faith way of just pulling all these random strings together, tying them in a knot, and saying the signs were there all along to this being the way things are. I need to find a better way to place my microphone. But anyway.
I don't know who benefits, but I know a lot of people have died. How's that working out for you, Ukraine? When I look at the social policies of the 1960s...
Again, he's tying this bureaucratic edifice into the war in Ukraine, as if we made a decision that sort of induced Vladimir Putin to sort of enact his genocidal erasure of Ukrainian identity as a justification for attempting to take over the country. They love to do this thing where they grant maximal agency to liberal actors and grant full ownership of the results of interactions of complex systems, global actors, random inputs from the environment. They love, love, love to take all these complex variables, collapse them down, and grant maximum agency to left liberal actors as to the results of all these interactions and say, look at what you guys have done. It's effective. Again, it's just more and more rhetorical strategies that they love to employ.
Which were supported by almost all academics. And I look at basically, Professor Allen was talking about the legacy of devastation that these policies have left over the last 50 years. They were all approved by the best social scientists of the time. I see the same effect where the system is not evolving the best and truest ideas, it's involving the most powerful ideas and in a way the most pernicious ideas. And I can't help but relate that to Professor Allen's belief that positive liberty, in other words, power, is an essential goal of human nature.
Sure, your response, Professor Allen, whether or not what he said is factually or historically correct, if there's something structurally wrong which is producing what he claims to be the case about professors and academic elites of that sort?
So there's a lot there, so I'm not going to respond to the whole picture there. I think that's not what our resolution is about.
That'd be really hard. That'd be really hard to respond to in a live setting. He just took a whole bunch of things, strung them all together, put them in a nice little package and said, here's my big bag of shit. Deal with it. And I think she's right in a live setting to not deal with each of those. I'm sitting here, I can pause and attack each point one by one. But, when you're in a live debate and you're on your feet and you have limited time to respond, you got to pick your battles. And she did the right thing here.
I will say a few things. For starters, science is a hard enterprise, and science is also a bureaucratic enterprise. Both of those things are true simultaneously. Scientists do work according to a set of norms for inquiry that are of a very high standard, is short of it, and they hold each other to a very high standard, and they do put each other under intense competitive pressures. Is it possible that bureaucratic pressures are also affecting how science unfolds? Yes. Should science take a look at itself and consider how it's doing its work? Yes. I think all those things are the case. But sciences generally have established very high standards for their work and maintain a commitment to testing and evaluating what they're doing. But I think the important question here, more broadly, just to bring us back to our original resolution, is whether or not this university in particular is in a place where it can do work that is for the good of our society. And the answer to that question is yes. And the reason for that answer is because we are very clear about core values. Those are values of veritas. They are also values of pluralism. Again, those things are mutually supportive of each other. And it is possible both to stand up.
He's sort of reclaiming this concept of truth that he sort of asserted is purely in the domain of the concrete, purely in the domain of the readily observable, purely in the domain of, I guess you could say, common sense. That is a common invocation among right-wingers, right? Like, things, true features of the world are readily observable. Like, common sense is most of what you need to govern your life and go about the world. All these hoity-toity liberal abstractions that left-wingers come up with, like, those will lead you astray. Those will render you unhappy. Those are tools they use to control you. You know, all you need is your own two eyes and what you can see and what you can observe readily in front of you. Again, take these abstract concepts, flatten them, concretize them, attack the straw man. And she's sort of rebutting that here by saying, hey, the truth is not incompatible with pluralism, with equality, with these liberal concepts. And we see the positive results of them in our world. We see the very real, very manifest outcomes of implementing these beliefs. You know, just because they don't have some like physical cognate in the real world doesn't make these abstractions any less real than something in front of your eyes. So she's sort of addressing that sort of right-wing fallacy that's a common attack on liberal thought.
For and defend values of academic freedom and intellectual freedom, and also to put yourself on a path of reform and renewal. We can defend by renovating.
And again, like another common attack is on liberal institutions by right-wingers is that they stagnate, they're sclerotic, they're unresponsive to the needs of the people, they're unresponsive to the popular will, they're unresponsive to the good of the society and the populace. But again, a solid part, a core tenet of any liberal philosophy is, review in sort of this like almost like scientific method process. Liberalism, I personally view liberalism as a political manifestation of the scientific method. You know, experiment, observe the results, apply those results to the real world, look at what you get, and rinse and repeat. You know, like renewal is a core tenet of any liberal system. Again, we do see some scleroticism by virtue of the fact that institutions tend to be sticky, they tend to have a lot of inertia, they tend to be difficult to change and to reform, but that doesn't mean we don't need them. Like you have these competing concepts that are equally important to the function of a viable institution that people like Curtis Yarvin will attack. You know, the need for consistency and the need for renewal, as Professor Allen says. These concepts are not necessarily in tension with one another, although they do work against each other. They are both necessary parts of a viable liberal democracy. And we'll get more into concepts like that later. But again, like we do have to deal with these tensions, but that doesn't mean that this mode of political organization isn't viable.
And that is, I believe, the path that we're on.
All right, perhaps we can get into closing statements. I think they've allotted 5 to 10, perhaps it was 8 minutes. Mr. Yarvin, if you'd like to start your closing remarks.
So maybe I can, in my closing remarks, I could do something a little unusual and kind of argue Professor Allen's side, for the moment, because I think we've seen sort of maybe a little too little of, I've been making the case, and I would like to think somewhat successfully, against oligarchy. Not as an abstract system, because of course we've seen, all of the 3 forms can work in their own way in different societies, in different structures. Another name for, the positive name for oligarchy is aristocracy. I think Harvard has always, tried to represent, the rule of the best. And, even you see it recovering from the witch craze of the 1690s. You see it recovering from the wokeness craze of the 2020s. And I think it is capable of recovering, and I want to see it recover. And one of the lessons, one of the things that I say to basically people who are on like my side, not that I'm a partisan, I'm just an intellectual. One of the things that I say, to people on my side when I encounter these elite institutions is I'm like, you sort of go through 3 stages of looking at these institutions. First, you see them very distantly, and you see them according to the kind of mythology of the institution. And the mythology of the institution is that there's this incredible cornucopia, this incredible banquet of, intellectual delights. Every form of truth is laid out, et cetera, et cetera. And you get, closer to these things, and you start to smell them, and you're like, well, especially in certain areas, I'm really looking at a vast dung heap. And that's the attitude that I think many Trump supporters have. They have a very, they're just like, there's nothing here, this needs to be scattered to the wind. I would say look closer at that dung heap, and you'll find always in every one of these elite institutions that I have come into contact with, there are real kernels of corn amidst the dung. Okay, and these are the seeds of basically the next generation that are, lead to renewal. There are people that really believe in these values. The values are eternal. Veritas is eternal, and so on and so forth. And when we see, and I believe that I agree with Professor Allen, I believe that there's a capacity for renewal here, but I also believe that it, takes looking very, very hard at what Harvard is and became during the 20th century, which is very different from what it was in any of the past centuries. And
Okay, so again, it's funny, like he attacks these sort of abstractions of liberal thought, but he has to construct all these metaphors to attack them with. As much as you might want to concretize everything, as much as you want these truths, quote unquote, to be facially obvious, to be facially observable, you still require degrees of abstraction in any mode of organization for a complex society. So he constructs this metaphor of a cornucopia of truths within these liberal institutions. And when you observe them up close, you see that they are really a rot that needs to be cleansed and, like he said, scattered to the wind. And he's become disillusioned with the Trump movement by this point, even though it's 11 months ago. By this time, we already are seeing signs that the Trump administration is going to be what most liberals knew it would turn out to be, most left liberals at least. But, at this point, a lot of people who were former supporters of his, like Curtis Yarvin, who believed themselves to be the more intellectual vanguard of this right-wing philosophy, are becoming disillusioned with the Trump movement as, very early on, it turned into a full-on grift. And so Trump was exposed to not be the virile strongman that would actively lead them into their glorious future. They recognize the need for bureaucracies, but they want to repurpose them to their will, repurpose them to carry out their political objectives. So yes, they have to tear them down, but they have to maintain the concept of some form of legitimate bureaucracy. They won't call it that, they'll rename everything, but effectively they will just be rebuilding similar institutions, but instead of having them serve the democratic will, just be tools for them to affect their autocratic will.
When we sort of put it up against, I've sort of discussed, ad nauseum the virtues of an ideal monarchy, and what we have in the Trump administration is very far from being a monarchy at all, because Trump, as he says, is really a rebel and not an emperor, and he's disrupting a system rather than creating a new system. But also, when we look at that,
this is just cope by, to deal with his disappointment in how the Trump administration has turned out. So he's sort of recategorizing Trump away from what his goals are to sort of cope with this failure.
See many of the failings of monarchy. And so when we, to come back to my updated Aristotelian trinity, where monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy become authority, prestige, and popularity, we see in the Trump administration, we see these classic tropes of authoritarian populism. And it's not wrong, even though Trump is not Hitler, it's not wrong to say that these are both authoritarian populist regimes, and that there's something brittle and something broken and something questionable and something wrong about authoritarian populism without a backbone of prestige, without a backbone of aristocracy, without institutions. And I would say, just as the sort of the challenge of these institutions is to renew themselves, the challenge of the enemies of these institutions is to explain where we go from here. and how that prestige is regenerated, and whether it's generated, by the kernels of corn, sprouting again into a new beautiful cornfield, whether it's represented by new institutions is unclear. But what is clear is that prestigious institutions are necessary and essential. Prestige is essential. Democracy, in my strict meaning of the word democracy, populism is not enough. Authority is not enough. Veritas is necessary. Institutions are necessary. Institutions that filter truth from error through our Darwinian process, which is, again, the ideal of science, which is a very, very valid ideal, are necessary. But when you see science being filtered for power or for empire building rather than for veritas, and there are many, many examples of this in science that do not involve killing 20 million people, that just involve, wasting a lot of time. I guess I always use the amyloid hypothesis as my example of that. You basically see a really considerable amount of redirection that needs to take place and restructuring that needs to take place to serve these ideals. Whether that restructuring...
He tortures the metaphor, right? So, he is an authoritarian. He does have these authoritarian impulses. And he is anti-egalitarian. He does not believe that all humans are equal. That is why he keeps invoking these sort of Darwinian concepts and metaphors, like talking about corn amidst the dung heaps. He is asserting that there are people who are better, superior humans to others, and those people should be chosen through some sort of process through which you determine their superiority to lead. He wants institutions, but he wants them to be repurposed to this sort of authoritarian vision. Okay, he will never use the word authoritarian in a public landscape to describe his view, although you can infer it from a lot of what he's saying. But he is basically asserting an authoritarian manifestation to sort of guide society forward by virtue of their merit and superiority, that is innate in some way, shape, or form that he believes to be readily observable. And, frankly, it will probably align with his views on race and similar ethnic or genetic categories. Don't be fooled by the language and the metaphors he's deploying here.
Structuring takes place as a result of an internal process of renewal or an external process of forced renewal is, I think, very, very unclear in the historical situation in which we exist. But I would, and I hope we can agree on this, institutions like the university that we're at are necessary and essential, and a lot of change is needed within them.
Thank you, Professor Allen.
Thank you. We can agree that universities like this are essential and have a distinguished history and also have available to them a distinguished future, that they do also have within them already the energies and dynamism of renewal. The question really, I think, is about the broader context. What are those institutions contributing to? Are they contributing to the ongoing life of a free society for free and equal self-governing citizens, or for an alternative? One of the arguments in Mr. Yarvin's book is that Hitler and Stalin gave absolute monarchs a bad name. And in his argument, they gave absolute monarchs a bad name because, in his argument, they were driven to excess, the excesses of the Holocaust and the gulags, because of existential threats from the Anglo-American alliance. Now, this is not good history of the unfolding of the totalitarian impacts of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. So I say that to make the point that as we consider the future of institutions of civil society, we have to be equally clear-eyed and honest about what we can and should desire in our political institutions. Absolute monarchy is not a path to the protection of freedom. In that regard, we need the same thing both in our political institutions and in our civil society institutions. We need renovation in our universities, we need renovation in our democracy. But in both cases, we should absolutely preserve the anchors for human freedom.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so there she does a good job of addressing the core assertions of his political philosophy by attacking both right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism that sort of each in their own way manifested various aspects of what he thinks is the optional mode of governance, whether you're talking about Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia. Both of them sort of exercised an absolute rule over their people. They existed in a state of paranoia and made bold assertions that about the nature of humanity, about the relationships humans have to one another, that do not line up with the best modes of organization for maximizing human flourishing, and they both ended up collapsing in upon themselves over different timescales and for different reasons, but neither proved to be a viable mode of organization in the modern context. But Yarvin sort of wants to dress up his philosophy in a way that masks its sort of genetic relation to its antecedents and present it as a new way forward that more effectively draws on the successes of the past in a sort of pre-liberal world and can address the failures of the modern liberal context. But he provides no proof as to his assertions. Again, the only thing he needs to do to make his philosophy appear viable is to tear down, poison, whatever metaphor you want to use, the context we are existing in right now. So, if you agree with his political philosophy, probably gives you a lot of tools you could use. If you disagree, hopefully this helped you sort of learn the ways that, people like him sort of burnish their worldview, attempt to tear down existing systems rhetorically, and the straw mans they construct to sort of present a case for their philosophy that doesn't really rely on highlighting any of what they perceive to be the strengths. Just, attacking the failures or perceived failures of the current system because, no system is perfect and the current system is dominant and pretty ubiquitous across vast swaths of the planet. So there are plenty of targets to attack. But hopefully you learned a few ways to sort of address these issues if you ever encounter them in the real world or among your friends or, in basic political discussions. Now, this was mostly a debate review, so there were a lot of things I didn't get into too much detail on because they would have just required a bit too much deviation from the points being made directly. But one of the things I want to do with this platform is just address, sort of outline what left liberalism is as a philosophy, what its goals are, why it's useful, how it's implemented in the real world, especially within the context of the United States, and how best to sort of like be an ambassador for it and push it out, in your everyday context, in your day-to-day life, and have it be the most effective form of governance that it can be, because, we definitely need a lot of people who are clear fighters for the left liberal worldview, because we are under attack from all sides. And we just need to sort of collectively, as left liberals, if you are a left liberal watching this, come up with ways to sort of rhetorically burnish our worldview and make its advantages clear and palatable and understandable to other people. So hopefully that's something we can do here and come up with accessible language to convey that to other people.